Now we've got one more little bit to go through here, ladies and gentlemen, about the nakshatra of Ardra. And this is going to be combining a little bit of what we've learned of the character of the deity of this nakshatra, which is Rudra. We're going to combine his character with a more down-to-earth, methodical approach to interpreting planets inside the nakshatra of Ardra. Let's see what the author Radhe has to say about planets and important planets, etc., falling into the nakshatra Ardra. I'd like us to keep in mind that this author is a sidereal practitioner. As such, I think that sometimes they'll give examples of things, which I usually try to get past instead of mentioning if I can tell that it's a sidereal example that they're giving, like of actual celebrities and people who have lived. As well, in general, when we're reading through this, I don't consider it as undistorted in potential as what we've read already in Victicara's interpretations. But this author has done so much digging through the Vedas, I think that they often consider the character as relating more to what's given in the Vedas than the sign association. But we have to always be careful to make sure that they aren't blending the sign that this person would understand Ardra to be in. And in this case, they probably imagine it to be in Gemini. We have to make sure that they aren't blending the symbolism of Gemini with Ardra. That being said, they often do a good job with it. Let's move through it and be discerning in what we read here. This is the native of Ardra Nakshatra. Typically, someone with the moon here. But in general, this could also mean anyone with important placements in Ardra Nakshatra. What we read is, one thing is for sure. Just when you think you have this native figured out, you discover new angles in their paradoxical persona. Perhaps the best place to start with this complicated native is at the beginning, their challenging and problematic childhood. Early life complications can include literal or figurative abandonment. Rudra was disclaimed by his Vedic parents, the Vishvadevas. In this person's life, there might be a sense of being unloved or unwanted. There could be a discontent with what is perceived as an inappropriate name or nickname. As we know, it took Prajapati 8 tries to find a name that was grand enough for Rudra. And they might have to work for their parents' attention. Rudra yelled out at birth for the attention of his father. So thus, the native is often faced with the task of rebuilding his confidence and self-image. That does stick, and that's good stuff. That's very Ardra. Now, whether due to insufficient financial resources or inattention to the needs of their offspring, parents of this native may fail to provide nutritious or sufficient food for their child. As we know, the character of Rudra in the Vedas receives only the leftover sacrificial offerings in the Vedic Yagna ceremony. So, an early experience for Rudra natives, especially with the moon in Ardra, I should say Ardra Nakshatra natives. An early experience with male authority figures, particularly one's own father, cultivates in the native a clear preference to fend for themselves at some level. The native learns early on not to rely on others, as others consistently disappoint them, which again is especially not a great placement for the moon. unfortunately. Thankfully, in today's time, tropical astrologers would insist that the moon would be in Cancer. And the moon is okay. It's in its own sign in Cancer, at least. So it can learn to be this individual who doesn't need anything. But the moon actually is supposed to be open to the resources and help and love and emotions of those around them. So the moon, that's part of what the moon's job is. It's only an ill moon. Like, look, that's more descriptive of like the moon in Scorpio, which wants to do it all itself. The moon in Taurus identifies its emotions inherently with those who are aligned with its spirit and soul nature. That's Taurus. It's sharing in things in the material world. And that's where the moon is exalted. So the character of this Ardra moon, we could see how it would be difficult to carry on this narrative of someone who doesn't want to rely on others. That's significant. That significates a difficult moon placement. Now, regardless of the particulars, the native's childhood impels them to pursue a different path in life. That this new path is unlikely to be supported or accepted by their parents also suits the native's unconventional nature. In fact, everything about the native is a bit bizarre, for Rudra is unquestionably the misfit amongst the 33 divine forces of the Nakshatras. Being fascinated by the untamed forces of the universe, the Ardra native is drawn to fierce and dangerous aspects of nature, whether thunderstorms and tornadoes, wild animals and snakes, or cemetery grounds and slaughterhouses. A profession involving any of these might be ideal for an Ardra Nakshatra native. Perhaps the native is a storm chaser, a meteorologist, a wildlife biologist, a snake charmer, a mortician, or even a meat butcher. Rudra does, after all, in the Vedic literature, Rudra is known for having pierced Prajalpati in Prajalpati's form as a stag, as Brahma, who is Prajalpati. Rudra pierces the creator who had taken the form of a stag because of that whole story. Again, Rudra was protecting Prajalpati's daughter because Prajalpati, the creator, wanted to rape its own daughter, its own creation, in order to further creation. But it was this insidious, incestuous thing going on there, which Shiva sought to protect. So being a butcher goes into the character of Ardra in this way. In fact, even a butcher shows the character of Ardra Nakshatra as one who knows that eating meat is going to be done. So an Ardra person can say, well, if this is a fact of life, at least if I'm the one doing it, I know I can give it the proper care that it deserves. And, it's likely that an Ardra person, depending on what planets are in here and what's going on in the chart, the Ardra person might want to be like a halal butcher. Unless they are less awakened and just are feeling their Ardra Nakshatra soul and just want to get into that grimy aspect of life for its own sake, just being attracted to it. This is what the Ardra Nakshatra natives ought to just be aware of. Is being subliminally attracted to these dimensions of life, for better and for worse. The Ardra Nakshatra native may be perceived at times to be a risk taker. In reality, they possess a profound understanding of the hidden structures in nature. For example, they might be the expert gambler who rolls the dice only when the stakes involve a high degree of probability. Remember, there is an association of Rudra with gambling halls. Ultimately, what should be portrayed here is that, I'm going to say this, I'm going to say the most important thing first, which is that regardless, gambling is an ugly thing to do. And it's not sattvic at all. And most people should take care not to get into gambling. Shiva is not a gambler, but Rudra, in the unevolved form of Shiva, is associated with this kind of thing. And if you find yourself being wrapped up in this sort of thing, I will say, Ardra Nakshatra natives are the types who could have the hardness to do better in that world than others. But it should really only be done, if it's to be done, as some absolutely unavoidable means to an end. And really, gambling itself should never be a means to any end. Even if you win, you're only going to be compelled and addicted to the relief that one gave you, and you're going to do it again, and it's never really worth it. That's just me talking. But I'm not Ardra native, so I'll leave that up to you to figure out. But I don't recommend it. I think this book is more saying be careful with the association of gambling because you could be vulnerable to it. I think that's more of what the book is saying here, in my opinion. The Ardra Nakshatra natives' insight into nature's unseen forces also lends itself to proficiency in mystical fields such as witchcraft, sorcery, alchemy, or shamanism. Very interesting. That completely runs in a line with what I see going on here with Rudra. Now, having an intense personality, this person, with Ardra Nakshatra emphasis, is perpetually confronted by wrath, whether their own anger and frustration or the anger others inflict upon them. So hence, Ardra is aptly classified in Jyotish Shastra as a sharp or harsh Tikshna Nakshatra, as we've already seen. And of course, it shares this classification with Mula, with Ashlesha, and with Jyesta Nakshatras. These are the sharp, dreadful Tikshna Nakshatras. As the antithesis of the Pushya native, whose dharma is to preserve the traditions of society, just as Brihaspati, who is the deity of Pushya, ensures the survival of the elite Brahmin caste and its vidya, its purpose, its vision of reality. Ardra being the antithesis of Pushya, the Ardra native lives outside the norms of their culture. They're forever challenging the boundaries of conventionality and orthodoxy. Again, for better and or for worse. Probably both in the case of the life of an Ardra native. Sometimes they're just challenging things that don't need to be challenged, but sometimes they're the only one challenging the things that should be challenged. It's a hard line to draw, especially for the Ardra person. This unconventional, unorthodox nature and behavior may cause this native to turn away from the world, opting for a life of solitude. Their preference is to be surrounded by the beauty of nature and the call of the wild, rather than tall buildings and hordes of human beings. What better venue for contemplating the riddles of life or engaging in austerities than being out in the wild in solitude? Now, relationships are fraught with challenges for this native. They struggle with familial bonds earlier in life. Later, their unconventional lifestyle may alienate their spouse and friends. The Puranic Rudra in the Puranas smears himself with ash, decorates himself with snakes around his neck, styles his hair in dreadlocks, and wears only an animal skin loincloth. His unusual ways and the unusual ways of the native have far-reaching consequences. When Rudra is not accepted by Sati's father, she sacrifices her life for her love for Shiva, for Rudra, which is a whole other cool Puranic story. Although life is not always a picnic for the Ardra Nakshatra native, many gifts and talents are likely to emerge. First, by keeping their goal in sight and applying force, this native attains their aspirations and goals. Rudra is an excellent marksman. They score a bullseye. Rudra scores a bullseye on his first attempt every time, fixing his bow and arrow steady on the target, that being Prajapati's head, while exerting effort. That's how he put his arrow through Prajapati's head. Secondly, Ardra gives an interest in and an aptitude for healing, particularly alternative healing. With a keen awareness of medicinal properties of herbs and plants, this native may especially take to studying botanical medicine. Of course, Rudra is particularly adept at working with poison and other dangerous or unusual substances. This native's field of professional pursuits may expand to areas such as chemotherapy, drug and substance control, or the handling of chemicals and toxic materials. As for general attributes, the Ardra native is youthful, possesses strong limbs, and often sports an unusual hairstyle. There's an attraction for sharp objects, which explains the possible childhood obsession with pocket knives for Ardra natives. Now, something we read here is that Steven Spielberg is said to have Ardra as his Lagna, and this comes from astrodatabank.com, or whatever that is. Steven Spielberg is allegedly has Ardra Lagna, and he displays several typical Ardra characteristics. Spielberg comments on his sense of being a misfit amongst his friends due to his Orthodox Jewish upbringing. Spielberg often found himself an outcast, the only Jewish kid in school. It was the brunt of anti-Semitic prejudice and victimization in his early life. In his own words, Spielberg comments, "I was embarrassed because we were Orthodox Jews. I was embarrassed by the outward perception of my parents' Jewish practices. I was embarrassed to invite my friends over to the house. I wouldn't know how to explain this to my WASP friends." I don't know what WASP is and what that means or that's in reference to. But Spielberg went on to be one of the most successful film directors, screenwriters, and producers of all time. He achieved tremendous fame for such outlandish films as Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., and Raiders of the Lost Ark, all with subject matters befitting unconventional Ardra. They're evidence of his willingness to venture outside the norms of filmmaking. He also produced Schindler's List, a graphic portrayal of the discrimination experienced by Jews during the Holocaust. So therefore, Spielberg's risk-taking nature paid off handsomely. in his career. So it's interesting. I would have to look up myself whether Spielberg could be said to have the Lagna of Ardra. But I see it and I get it. And it's interesting, I think what that book was portraying there was an example of how the unorthodox, unconventional nature of Ardra can bring great world-dissolving, pointing the finger at very deep, weird, unconventional things. My friend Zuleika is giving me so much extra information. I appreciate you so much. Zuleika has mentioned WASP is a term that typically means upper-class, snooty, white Christian Protestants. So, obviously, Steven Spielberg, being a Jewish kid with an Orthodox Jewish family, would have felt like an outcast to these WASP friends, who were snooty, white-class, upper-class Christian Protestants. Thank you, Zuleika. You've been doing great for me this whole recording. So the outlandish, unconventional character of Spielberg helped him to produce these movies that are very hard, visceral, and very out there and wild, and sometimes difficult, like Schindler's List, which is about the Jewish people in the Holocaust being disseminated in the way that the hard Nazis were dealing with the Jewish people. Like, that's like looking into the crematorium. That's like sitting with the human skull. That's very Shiva and Ardra. And it did well for Steven Spielberg, only having his Lagna there. So this is a pretty good portrayal of the character, of this unconventionality that can bring so much goodness, hardness, realness through the Ardra Nakshatra native's life, character, and behavior, and destiny.